We have the aesthetics of impermanence, and the introduction will be by Sujata Chatterjee, who you can see to my left, and then we have Mr. Benoit Behel, who will be giving us a presentation, so please make them feel very warmly welcome, and take your phones on silent.
Thanks. Hello. How does one speak of a filmmaker who has made over 126 deeply researched documentary films, and yet making films is only one part of his work? He's an art historian, an author, a most eminent photographer, a record-setting traveler, a respected speaker at a breathtakingly long list of prestigious universities and museums across the world. He's also the first person who photographed the Buddhist paintings of Ajanta in their true color and detail. As an art historian, he has clearly established a continuous tradition of paintings in India since ancient times. How does one speak of an art historian who was transformed by the paintings of Ajanta 22 years ago? He became a man with a mission, which continues till today. A mission to share the compassionate vision which he saw in the paintings. You would understand his commitment to his work when you saw how he shoots his films. For two of his projects, one of making 26 films on the paintings of India, and the other of 26 films on the sculpture of India, he made journeys to all corners of India and to museums around the world. The shooting of each series was a monumental project in itself. For instance, the shooting schedule of the paintings of India covered museums in 13 countries and over 100 districts in 20 states of India. It was an odyssey of 90,000 kilometers spread over 240 days. In this journey, the shooting crew slept in more than 200 different places. There were days when the crew traveled by road for 15 hours in a day, besides the time spent on the actual shooting. For those 8 months of travel, the crew normally woke up each day at 3:30 a.m. and sometimes even at 2 a.m. in order to get extra hours for driving and a longer working day. And would you believe, nobody actually died. And oddly enough, none of them seemed to hate him. Benoit has researched and photographed Buddhist art and heritage in 19 regions of the world. He has written considerably on Buddhist art and has been invited by the most noted universities to speak on the development of Buddhist philosophy and its reflection in art. His landmark book on the Ajanta caves is published by Thames and Hudson, London, and within the next few months, his book on the history of Indian art, published by Wisdom Tree, India, will be in the bookstores. The purpose of Indian art, including that of Buddhism, was to help us on the spiritual path, to elevate us. So, ladies and gentlemen, Benoit Behel.
Thank you very much, Sujata. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. 22 years ago, I had the good fortune to, not loud enough? Would you try to adjust that, please? Is it better? Can you hear me? No? Would you adjust that and make it a little louder, please? Can you hear me now? Yes, 22 years ago, I had the fortune to photograph the paintings of Ajanta, the 5th century, beautiful paintings of Ajanta, which are recognized as the fountainhead of the Buddhist paintings of the world. I was invited to show these paintings everywhere, and you'll be very happy to know that in all the major museums where these were shown in Europe, in USA, in Japan, so many other places, there was a unanimous response that the paintings of Ajanta must surely be the finest art of humankind. It was a unanimous response of critics, art experts, everywhere. Indeed, there is an immense technical virtuosity in this art, and not just as art which is very old, which belongs to the 5th century mainly, but art which for its technical virtuosity can compare favorably, as all art experts said, everywhere, with even the finest of art that is produced up till today. And mind you, that is technical virtuosity that we are talking about. But more than that, the paintings are so beautiful and so important because of the vision of life which they contain. It is a vision of life which sees a great oneness in all that there is, in you and me, in all the beings, the animals, the birds, the trees, in all that there is. In fact, in this vision, our understanding of ourselves as separated beings, our ego, is considered to be an illusion. And the purpose of art is to lift those veils of illusion, to help us to perceive the grace which underlies all that there is. In fact, the philosophy of aesthetics was very highly developed in India in a very early period. In this philosophy, it is believed that the moment when you respond to beauty, whether in nature or in art, that moment when you see a beautiful sunrise or perhaps a fine painting from Ajanta, that is a moment which is akin to the joy of salvation itself. It is this moment in which those veils of illusion are lifted. The veils of Maya or Mithya are lifted, and you are seeing that grace which is there. And therefore, in Buddhism and all the other Indic faiths, art has had an enormously important role to play. One must remember that in the Indic philosophic vision coming from the Upanishads, there are no gods. There are deities. Deities were the personification of concepts and qualities within you. We meditate on the deities. We adore the deities because puja is adoration, it is not prayer. We adore these, we meditate upon these deities till those qualities are awakened within you. Qualities which could be grace, qualities of wisdom, qualities of compassion. And when these grow within you and fill you completely, you have become that deity. So that is the purpose of Buddhist art and other Indic art, which I take you on this journey to share. Those are the caves of Ajanta. 31 caves in the horseshoe-shaped gorge of the Vaghora river in Maharashtra. Buddhist caves made around the 2nd century BC and then again around the 5th century AD. And this is how the paintings were earlier seen in the orangish light which was cast upon them, and those are the real colors of the paintings. As some of you might know, I am credited with photographing these paintings in dark conditions and having captured their colors, their true colors for the first time. And this is a princely figure carrying an offering of lotuses to the Vajrapani painted in cave 1. The Vajrapani, the Bodhisattva Vajrapani. The Bodhisattva, as you know, is a being on his way to enlightenment. And the Vajrapani is one who bears a thunderbolt. And with the glorious crown that he wears, he brings before us the majesty of the spirit. On the other side of the entrance to the shrine of cave 1 is he, the Padmapani, the Bodhisattva, who brings before us the peace of the spirit. He is the bearer of the lotus. And I take you to a closer view of him. You would see the monkeys playing above his left shoulder to your right. You would see a heavenly musician above his right shoulder to your left. And with all this activity painted around him, he looks within. It is this look within, this inward look, which is the theme of ancient Indian and Buddhist art. On the same wall of cave 1, we see a couple in harmony. It is this quality of harmony which pervades the world of these paintings. And you would see here that marvelous rendering of form, that gradual lightening and deepening of color which persuades the eye of the roundedness of form, a quality which the paintings of Ajanta are extremely well known for, a quality which has traveled from this fountainhead of Ajanta to the classic paintings of Asia. On the left wall of cave 1, this is the Mahajanak Jataka. Jatakas, as you know, are stories of the previous birth of Lord Buddha. And here you see him born as King Mahajanaka, and he is listening to the sermon of this hermit. You would notice the antelope who listened to the sermon with as much attention as any of the human figures. For in this vision of life, there is really no difference between the human figures and the animals. And Mahajanak is a person you see seated on the ground in front of the hermit, and I take you to a closer view of him. He was a glorious king, a powerful king who had in fact won back the lands earlier lost by his father. But you see the humility with which he sits on the ground there and looks towards the hermit with an expression of adoration upon his face, which even all that damage has not obliterated. And this is the humility with which we rise. Having heard that sermon, Mahajanak decides to give up his palace life, his kingly life, and to go into the forest to become a hermit. You see him here announcing that decision in the palace. You see his mother behind him, and in front of him is his wife, Queen Shivali. Her eyes are painted in a way which denotes that she is sad or weeping. By the 5th century, when these paintings were made, the oldest known detailed treatise on painting in the world had been penned as the Chitra Sutra out of ongoing earlier traditions. And there are an infinite number of suggestions given to painters about how to paint different kinds of human beings, how to paint animals, how to make landscapes, about 6 different ways to carry out shading. And there are these 4 different ways indicated of painting eyes, which would convey different expressions. And hers are made according to the shapes which are suggested for someone who is sad or weeping, as she might be because her husband is announcing that he is going to leave her and go away. Her garments might be of interest to you. The lower garment is woven in the form of ikkat, which is practiced till today. You might be interested to know that by the beginning of the first millennium, there were many big Roman colonies in the Deccan, because they were extensively trading and picking up vast numbers of textiles from India, particularly the Deccan region, which had this flourishing trade. And in fact, you have Pliny the Elder writing in Rome, I think in the 1st century BC, that Roman coffers are being emptied for buying too many fine textiles from India. To the side of that painting, you have these palace maids who are responding to the same news that the queen is going to be left alone by her husband, who's going to go into the forest. And you would see shock written upon the face of one of them and sadness on the face of the other too. You would also notice the very warm exchange between the 2 standing figures in a moment of sadness. Indeed, that the very human touch is something which the world seems to have lost. And having made that decision, you see Mahajanak here riding out of the palace. You see that inward look which has come into his eyes, and you see that profound peace which seems to be coming to him. He begins on an inward journey, which really is the purpose of Buddhist art. In cave 17, I show you this painting of the Vishvantara Jatak. Prince Vishvantar is the last birth of the Bodhisattva before he will be born as Gautama Siddhartha. And here again, Prince Vishvantar is informing his wife, Princess Madri, that he will be renouncing his worldly life and going into the forest. He suggests to her that she should stay behind in the palace, as she will not be used to the difficult life outside. She, however, decides to go with him. You might notice the perspective in the painting. You would see the receding pillars and that vessel which that man carries. You would see that elliptical mouth of it, which is indeed remarkable for a painting of the 5th century. You would also notice the purse that she dangles from her hand, and the purse strings are curved, persuading your eye of the movement of the purse as she dangles it. This is the sort of details which are suggested in the Chitra Sutra. The Chitra Sutra expects of the painter that he should be able to paint in his unmoving medium the movement of waves, the movement of leaves as the breeze goes through them. It's quite wonderful, really, that at such an early, in such an early time, such were the expectations from the painters. A delightful rendering of the Mahisha Jataka in cave 17. Buddha born as a Mahisha, a buffalo, and this pesky monkey troubles him but the kindly Bodhisattva does not mind. In fact, do I imagine it, or do you also see a smile on the face of the Mahisha? After the delight of the Ajanta paintings, I take you to a deeper understanding of the aesthetics which and the reasons which underlie Buddhist art. The ancient treatise on art making states that the best way to be able to imagine the eternal is formless. And deities are created in order to help us on the path, in order to give us something that we can relate to, and yet create peace within us so that we are moving towards a final understanding of the formless, the arupa, the nirgun. And accordingly, at an early stage among the Ajivikas, Buddhists and Jainas, the point where you came to meditate was made as formless as possible, the stupa. In the so-called Hindu tradition, you had the linga, which means symbol or mark. It evolved later into another very beautiful philosophic idea in the Shiva Linga, which was also the phallic symbol, one of the great philosophical symbols of the world. But to begin with, in all the Indic faiths, it was either the stupa or the linga where you finally came to meditate. And you see, the last one was the stupa of the 2nd century BC at Sanchi. And here you see a reconstructed stupa of the 3rd century BC at Vaishali. And around the stupa, what you see here are the railings of the Bharhut stupa, which was made in Madhya Pradesh and are preserved in the Indian Museum at Kolkata. So around the stupa were made these railings, and on the railings were made the multiplicity of the forms of the world. It is this marvelous play between the formless eternal, the arupa, the nirgun, the shunyata, and at the same time a fulsome recognition of the fact that we are surrounded by Maya. We are surrounded by innumerable forms of the world, and there's no point in denying it. So around the stupa and on the temple walls was made the forms of the world. And also on the gateways, you see here the 1st century gateway of the great stupa at Sanchi. And the gateway is beautifully sculpted, and it has again the numerous forms of the world. Plants are made, men and women are made, mythical creatures are made. It's this whole exuberance of life, of nature, which is seen in front of us. And at the gateway, as you go around the stupa, and finally you are going to enter in your search to come and meditate and try to realize at a deep level within you the reality of the formless eternal. At the gateway, you have the first deity of Indic thought, Maya herself, the Yakshi. She touches a tree and it bursts into blossom and fruit. Such is the power of Maya. Such is the power of this illusion which holds us spellbound in this world. The earlier was a Yakshi of the 2nd century BC from the Bharhut stupa railings, and here you see a beautiful Yakshi who convincingly portrays this this fruitful abundance of nature in the gateway of the 1st century AD, great stupa at Sanchi. And you leave all this behind to go towards that which will not distract you with the forms of the world. As you sit to meditate upon how all this which you saw is an illusion, and you wish to gain true knowledge. This stupa that you see is carved out of the heart of the mountain in the Western Ghats. This is in the beautiful caves of Bhaja in Maharashtra. This is about the, this one is about the 2nd century BC. There are about 1,000 great caves hewn out of the hills of Maharashtra. It is perhaps the greatest treasure of art. You must go there sometime. The caves at Karle will present you some of the most dignified and beautiful sculpture ever created by man. Again, showing you the power of Maya. You will see that fruitful abundance, and yet with this great sense of dignity. A place which spells out this Buddhist philosophy beautifully. In fact, I think it is in its own way the most important Buddhist monument of the world is the Borobudur Stupa in Indonesia. And the best part of it is that the Muslim population around the Borobudur Stupa understand this philosophy so completely and are able to explain it to you. And it is in fact quite wonderful to see that very, very, very large Muslim populations of the world. I travel a lot. I have not only documented Buddhist heritage in 19 countries, but I am presently documenting Islamic heritage in 42 countries. So I get to see a lot of things firsthand. And it has been very interesting for me to find that perhaps 95% of the Islamic populations are among the most open-minded, gentlest, nicest of people anywhere. At the Borobudur Stupa and the people of that area, I mean, these people, Muslim people, tell you that this is the finest book of the understanding of human life in the world. So such wonderful people are numerous, so many and everywhere. And somehow I feel that present day media makes us lose sight of them. So this is a deviation from my subject, but I just felt like sharing that. I heard some comments yesterday about negative things happening. I wanted to say this. And now the bottom level of the Borobudur Stupa presents to us the life of passions, Kamadhatu. And as you proceed upwards, at a higher level, you are presented Karma Dhatu, life in the world and how you can improve it through ways in which you find greater peace for yourself. And then as you proceed, you climb up and walk around the stupa again. You have the Rupa Dhatu, the Lalit Vistar, the drama of the life of the Buddha. Rupa, as you all know, is form. And this is the personification of that enlightenment within you. And after that, you proceed through the gateway of Kala. You leave the illusion of time itself behind you. And then there is only Arupa, the stupa. Beautiful monument which so completely takes you through all the steps of Buddhist philosophy. One of the earliest deities in Buddhist monuments, and here you see her in the 2nd century stupa at Sanchi, is Lakshmi, Gaja Lakshmi. She continues in worship in Japan and certain other places, and of course in Hindu worship. But the earliest examples that we see of her portrayal, here again, this is a 1st century portrayal of Lakshmi. You see her here in Japan. Saraswati. Oh, sorry, that was Lakshmi. Now here we have Saraswati. Saraswati is the 2nd most revered deity of Japan. There are scores of temples to her, even within the Tokyo area itself. And you will be pleased to know that Hindu deities that we have forgotten in India, that we don't think about so much, like Vayu for instance, are deeply revered in Japan. And there are many places. It's quite amazing once you travel through the countries of Asia. You see this great shared heritage, this vision of life which looked always beyond the material, whose art, whose aesthetics was always about that which took us away from the material world to that sublime peace which you can find within you. And this is Nagarjuna Konda. I wanted to mention to you that even while a king was worshipping Hindu deities, we see here at from Nagarjuna Konda onwards in the 3rd, 4th century AD, that his wife, the queen, was worshipping the Buddha, and she was patronizing Buddhist monuments. You see that also in the 5th century at Ajanta. And I will mention here that when we speak of so many divided things that occur in the modern world today, you should be aware that every single one of all the Buddhist monuments of ancient India were made in the rule of a king who was worshipping Hindu deities. Your school books don't tend to tell you that, your college books don't tend to tell you that, but if you go to a large library and you pick up any monument of that period and you study it, you will find from the inscriptions of the king who ruled at that time that he was worshipping Hindu deities. Therefore, the idea of divisions is a very modern idea. It is an idea which was instilled during the colonial period. Actually, there were no divisions of religions in ancient India. And this is the warmth and the beauty of the vision which spread from here and really pervaded the whole of Asia. It is a very aesthetic vision. It is a vision which always helps you understand that joy that there can be within you. A vision which helps you understand the fruitless noise and confusion of the material world. And really it is about time that all of us came to understand that and help to contribute to a more peaceful understanding for all the world. A stupa of about between the 8th and 10th century BC. As I mentioned to you, the stupa was the primary point of meditation of all the faiths in India. Somehow the colonial historians seem to have stressed the fact that, or created an impression that it is a Buddhist monument. So I show you a stupa which has been excavated of the 8th to the 10th century, which is very close to the Nalanda site. another view of the same. And this is from the railing of a Jain stupa, which is in the Lucknow Museum. The Lucknow Museum and the Mathura museums have substantial objects of art from the Jaina stupas of the early period. And the Jain faith and its art was practically identical to that of Buddhism. As a matter of fact, there was nothing called Buddhist art or a Buddhist style of art in the ancient period, as art historians will be able to tell you. In India, there was art, and the guilds of artists, the same people, were at the service of all the faiths. And with practically every family of ancient India, whose inscriptions are in front of us, every single one of them. In a family, if a man is worshipping Shiva, his wife is worshipping the Buddha or Mahavir, their son and daughter are worshipping anybody they please. So that is a wonderful heritage which I think it is time for us to become more aware of. And I bring you around again to one of the finest paintings ever made. So here you have the complete view of the aesthetics of Buddhism. The look is inward, for the material world is only an illusion. And at the same time, there is a grace in the presentation. As you respond to the grace, it awakens that grace within you. It brings a joy and peace, and therefore helps to still the turbulence of the material world, to help you think of that which is within. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Is there somebody to moderate any questions which may be asked? Is there somebody who would like to ask a question? Yes, please. There's a lady here. Your mic is not on.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Good afternoon, sir. This was a stunning presentation. You talked about universality in terms of guilds that are painting different religious paintings or sculptures and things like that. I wanted to bring in the comparison of Greek mythology and the depiction, and as well as Hindu, or when we look at Yakshis and all, the dryads in the Greek mythology, the way the Yakshi is being used as a column. You had the columns in ancient Greece as well, where you had the body which replaced the column. What are your thoughts on that comparison, sir?
You've struck on a number of very interesting and important points. And, well, first of all, the guilds. In fact, the marvelous thing is that it is in ancient India, and here I'm addressing only the beginning of your question. In ancient India, it was nothing of this was patronized by the rulers. If you go to the Sanchi monument, for instance, 631 inscriptions still survive, which tell you that this particular pillar was patronized by a fisherman. This particular pillar was patronized by a tailor. This one by a housewife, for a farmer, a nun, etc., etc., etc. And this applies to all the monuments of ancient India. It is the people who are patronizing the monument bit by bit by bit. In the ancient period, if your school history book tells you that King so-and-so made so-and-so temple, close the book. And you have enough books that tell you that, but go to a bigger library and look for inscriptions and look for the real history. The kings of the ancient period did not directly patronize any monument, even to their own personal deity. That happened later. The first temples that you see which were patronized by kings are under the Pallavas. So it is 7th, 8th century onwards. Before that, all this art is the art of the people. And it is what is to be done and how it is to be done is entirely decided by the artists. And that is why, if 631 inscriptions survive out of possibly 2,000, so with 2,000 people patronizing it, your monument is very obviously, when you see it, a beautiful harmonic composite whole. It is the artists who do their thing. This is something which the modern world should learn from. My own understanding is that the moment an artist is doing something for a particular patron or to earn money, his art is already finished. That is not, he is not going to produce real art. So you have a system in the ancient period in which the artist is respected for doing what he has to do. That is his dharma. He does that. And society gives him the patronage to do so. The society does not come along and say, I want the Vishwantara Jatak. No. Society folds his hand in front of the artist and says, well, you do what you have to do. Okay. Now we come to Greek art. There's some very interesting research which is being done. Particularly, I came across this large book by a professor at a university in New York, which is drawing parallels between Upanishadic philosophy and Greek philosophy, and definitely suggesting that there was much interaction, and also most of the time suggesting that the Greeks seem to have picked up a lot of philosophic ideas from the Upanishads, and they give their reasons why they feel it is like that. And very interestingly, I forget her name just now, but the Greeks also seem to have had a deity who is rather similar to the concept of Maya. So please excuse me that I am not able to remember. Actually, I'm very bad at remembering names. Even my friends can get angry with me. But there is a lot of similarity there. Okay, now where the Greek art becomes very different from Indic art is that in the Indic vision, the material forms around us are not important in themselves. So it is the grace which underlies the forms which is the purpose of the art. As a matter of fact, the most wonderful thing about Indic art, to my understanding, is that you have 2,000 years of art in which you have hundreds of thousands of works of art which are of exquisite quality, that portray deities, that portray animals, that portray trees, that portray mythical creatures, and yet you do not have a single portrait of even the king who was ruling at that time. And the reason should be obvious to us, which is that the ephemeral personality is of no importance. The whole purpose of the art is to leave that ego behind, to be able to give up those attachments, to be persuaded by the gentleness of the art, to realize that peace within and give up the material attachments. And therefore, no personality is depicted except for this brief intrusion during the Kushana period. And the Kushanas came from southern China and Central Asia, and while they were ruling, they made portraits of themselves. But after the 1st, 2nd century AD, Indic art immediately reverted back to itself. And then all the way up to the Pallavas, there was not a single portrait. The first portrait of Indian sculpture is at Mamalapuram in the 8th century. The first portrait in Indian painting of a king is of the end of the 10th century at the Brihadishvara temple at Tanjavur. Okay, so that is where the difference is, because Greek art became very enamored with the human form itself and tried to start capturing it in ways which were realistic. Whereas Indic art used the human form in an idealized way for you to realize that which is within and that which is beyond the human form. Any other questions?
Sir, excuse me, to your left, sir. Sir, to your left.
Left and down. Thank you, Binoy. Your passion was really palpable. My question is very simple. What are the 3 or 4 main human qualities or values that you imbibed during this wonderful journey of art which you'd like to share with the house? There are a lot of young people here.
Yes. Actually, for me, a very important personal journey began at Ajanta. Those weeks that I spent in front of the paintings of Ajanta did transform my life. There was a world of compassion in those paintings. There were these thousands of figures which were painted on the walls, and each of them had this sense of caring and warmth towards each other. You know, all the values which were enshrined in my education and the values that I wanted to live with always were so beautifully not only contained in the world of these paintings, but somehow at a very, very deep level, they were all reconfirmed to me. So I came out of those caves extremely happy and not at all bothered by shall we say, by the importance of all kinds of material concerns. This whole we are so often persuaded in this world that we have to be so clever and we have to be so dynamic, they say these days, and ambitious, and all kinds of things like that. And quite often the best of human life is forgotten. In that experience of those weeks at Ajanta, it was marvelous to just lose oneself in the beauty of the warmth of those artists and come out full of that. So the first thing, the most important thing was that.
We have a question here, just in front of you, sir.
Hi. My question is that apart from the spirituality aspect, the craft itself of painting, I've heard a lot of times that the artist looks for something. So if an artist is there, creating that, he wouldn't really have that idea of oneness. He wouldn't really have that. He would be looking for something. And if different individuals have created those paintings. Have you found something which is different? And if you relate that to the spirituality aspect, if you have any comments on that.
Yes, thank you. Of course, I'll just say a little thing which I thought of when you were saying that. First, I'll just say that, which is that the artist, of course, always makes himself, and in every line draws by an artist, you can see him. It's a wonderful thing, really. And what I found in those paintings, and before that I had found when I made a film called Another Look at Khadi, which was about the socio-economic philosophy of Gandhi. I made that in 1980, and that was my first experience of clearly seeing that there was a different vision of life, apart from the vision of life which I had inherited and learnt in my daily life and in my school and college education, and all the wonderful English literature which I had read, because I had really grown up speaking English. And first it was in 80, and then it was after that at Ajanta, and subsequently it became a continuous thing. Then I found that there was an altogether different vision of life itself, a completely different way of looking at the world. And it is a way of looking at the world which does not separate the ideal from the practical. The main thing which is pulling down the world today and is leading to and keeping up continuously discord, strife, a very hypocritical attitude which the so-called modern world takes every single day, is the division between the ideal and the practical. We can talk about ideals all that we want to, and then we can go home and we can sell armaments. And this is supposed to be normal. That is the problem. What you have in this early Indic vision is a wonderful, very plain kind of view, which is not afraid of the ideal, which realizes that in fact the purely ideal is the only finally practical. The lack of hypocrisy. And that is the kind of vision which you come across in the work and the hands of the artists of ancient India. And it is this which gives so much grace and compassion to everything that they do. And when you talk about individual differences, it needs to be examined, what we mean when we talk of individual differences. If I feel a great deal of frustration and modern society urges me to express that frustration in a great way, no, classic art of any kind, anywhere, never suggested that you do that. So finally, it is always a truth, it is always a grace, it is always that which stills the turbulence to which you go. And there is, of course, a very beautiful understanding of energy, of vigor, of courage. Your images of Durga, she is the personification of that energy within you with which you would face the demons of your ignorance. In later Buddhism, you have so many images which express that. But finally, as any Buddhist will tell you, it is all part of the expression of the same compassion.
To your left, sir. To your left, there's a question. And
Mr. Binoy, thank you very much, first of all, exactly for taking especially me to this enriching journey. Maybe the thanks may be a small token of my that gratitude to you. But my question may sound childlike, but this is a curiosity that's I'm asking, because I heard you're art historian. So do we come across some basis or some historical fact in the inscription which can tell exactly the depiction or the portrait, whatever like we see for Buddha? Is it the imagination of that artist, or exactly is it something which in fact that image existed, so that proves that this is the real portrait of that figure? If you can answer that, please.
Please remember that portraits were never the purpose of Indic art. The purpose was to take you away from the ephemeral personality. Please also remember that when the Buddha was born, all Buddhist traditions, there are many Buddhist traditions, but all of them, the first words that are in the mouth of the Buddha when he is born are, I am one who will tread the path walked by others before me. In fact, it is in the so-called modern world that we have started putting the focus on one Buddha. As any Buddhist would tell you, there is not one Buddha. I mean, the Theravada Buddhists deeply adore at least 28 Buddhas. We speak of the great art, I mean, particularly the Western world admires the art of the Gandhara period. And if you look at the Buddha figures made there, you would find that very few of them are of Gautama Siddhartha. They are of other Buddhas, Manushi Buddhas. So, particular personality is the failing, I will take the liberty of saying, of the modern period. These are all personifications, they're idealized depictions, taking us, in the case of the Buddha, towards the possibility of enlightenment, which is deep within you. So the Buddha is within you. As all Buddhists will tell you, that your aim would be to become a Buddha. So they cannot be the portrait of a Buddha already. How will you become another ephemeral personality?
We have time for 2 more questions. There's a lady over there we're going to come to, but first this gentleman here.
Sir, first of all, thanks to your deep study and collection. And my question is, you have such a splendid deep explanation of history and sculptures, but the government do not promote or encourage such kind of findings and knowledge. And even I think in the world, even not 1% people try to even understand the history. So what would you suggest, please?
Well, understanding history is only of any importance as far as it shows us something within ourselves and how we can improve ourselves. Otherwise, it's not really important. But it is a fact that the so-called modern world is very, very preoccupied with material things and material gains, and there is actually very little search for the truth in anything at all. There's a little talk about idealistic things, and universities are funded, but beyond that, when it comes to, I mean, I was telling you about the histories which are written, which are absolutely inaccurate, and It is a fact that the search for the truth is very little today. One of the main problems is that that which is true and that which is intellectual needs a little attention, a little sacrifice of your time and effort to understand. And we are functioning in a world today which is this wonderful, what do they call it, this market-driven world, in which there is a constant attempt to sell one thing or the other, and therefore all kinds of media would like to carry things which are not very intelligent, because it is the basest and most common interests of human beings which should be catered to, and there will be the largest number of people who will take a very deep interest in them, and therefore you do it, you gather audiences, and you you sell what you have to sell. The intellectual search, I'll give you an example of the dichotomy between the truth and what you see today. You go to the ancient caves of Buddhism. Go to Bhaja that we saw here, or rather go to Bedsa, and you will find, or go to Karle, you will find large sections of the hill are left intact in front of the cave. So you cannot see the cave from a long distance. That which is true and that which is important needs effort on your part to come yourself where you want to go. It is not advertised from a long distance off at all. As a matter of fact, till before the end of the 10th century, no temple in India was very tall or large. They were always small. The idea is never to try to sell or to advertise any of this. It has to be your own personal need and search for what is true. And everybody has to recognize that you have to make effort for your own good to try to realize what is true. And I think you would appreciate that we are living in exactly the opposite kind of society today, which is always trying to make things simpler and therefore sugarcoat it. That's not the way.
And a final... We have time for one final question. I'm so sorry we haven't got to everybody's, but if this lady here would like to ask her final question.
It was a beautifully rendered session. I just have one question, since you are widely traveled. Do we come across places where we can see the art of Buddhism, Mughal period and Hindus converging and coexisting together?
Well, if you really look at the ancient period, you have no division between the people of different faiths in South Asia. Now, what examples can I give you of a living nature in this? I mean, if you were to go to the most revered pilgrimage spot of the Jains, it is the Shatrunjaya Hill, Palitana. It is in Saurashtra, and you are there in on the hot plains, and you climb these thousands and thousands of steps up on the hills, and you come to this fairy tale sort of land where you are amid the clouds, and you have a few hills which are entirely covered with beautiful temples, and that is Palitana. Now, the first temple where you worship is that of an Islamic saint. And that is the spirit of South Asia. That's a continuing spirit even in Southeast Asia. I mean, if you go to Indonesia, you are going to a country where you have, it's an Islamic republic, and they celebrate the Ramayana more often and with more enthusiasm than we do in India. When the Islamic Republic of Indonesia had a financial crisis, on their banknote, just below where they write the Islamic Republic of Indonesia, they printed Ganesha. And I can give you many more such examples which are continuing, but for some reason, our media doesn't make us aware of it. And here I'm not only talking about press media, I'm talking about the books, I'm talking about the libraries, I'm talking about all that. Somehow does not convey this. What other examples can I give you? I mean, you have the most wonderful, one of my favorite personalities in Indian history is Sultan Ibrahim Adil Shah II of Bijapur, 16th century. So in his autobiography, what does he call himself? He calls himself the son of Ganesha. There was a session about Kashmir yesterday. I was very far back and they couldn't see me when I raised my hand to make a comment. But Kashmir is the place where Hindus and Muslims used to actually worship together until just the other day. They used to worship together. They also ate and celebrated together, which is why a Kashmiri Muslim does not eat beef and a Kashmiri Hindu does not eat pork. As a matter of fact, the most revered saint of Kashmir is Lal Ded, a Shaivite saint, equally revered by Muslims and Hindus. Her principal student, disciple, was Sheikh Nuruddin, also known as Nand Rishi, equally loved by all Hindus and Muslims of Kashmir. So actually there was, you go to the Kala Bhairava temple in Ujjain. Ujjain is one of the greatest cities of ancient India. You have oil lamps there which are still running on oil, originally given by a diktat of Aurangzeb. So I ask you to please examine all this, to please examine how a colonial ruler has in fact created a false history and persuaded us about all kinds of divisions. Like I said, like I was saying, all inscriptions of ancient India, as a rule, all inscriptions of ancient India show you that within a family, people were not worshipping the same deity. There were no separated religions in ancient India, and this is a simple factual thing. You just look at all the inscriptions. So I think we can look back at a beautiful vision and hope to translate it into the present. I'm sorry I've got a flight to catch and we'll have to call it off. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful session. I'm so sorry that you didn't all get to ask your questions. I know that there were some that really wanted to. We'd love to invite Mr. Behel, before he has his flight, to go over to the author signing desk for just a few minutes, hopefully about 10-15 minutes. So please, if you have any more questions burning that you'd like to ask, if you have any books you'd like signed, if you'd like to get a photograph with him, please go over to the author signing desk just to the left of the tent there. Thank you so much, Mr. Behel. Another round of applause for our wonderful panelists. So we're going to stop for